Hello everyone. In this module we're going to talk about sex and gender-based analysis, which is abbreviated often as SGBA. A little bit of background about sex and gender-based analysis. So most scholarship applications and grant applications in Canada require sex and gender-based analysis, either directly in terms of it's asked specifically as a section on a grant application or scholarship application, or sometimes also as a component of an equity, diversity, and inclusion statement. It's important to note that equity, diversity, and inclusion is not synonymous, or EDI is not synonymous with sex and gender-based analysis. I would say that sex and gender-based analysis might be a component of an EDI statement, but they are not exactly the same in such that equity, diversity, inclusion is a much broader concept. I also recommend sex and gender-based analysis section for a thesis proposal. And in both cases, these sections are typically sort of a paragraph in size. The rationale, so why do we complete sex and gender-based analyses? So the CIHR rationale is that sex and gender influence our risk of developing certain diseases, how well we respond to treatments, and how often we seek health care. Accounting for sex and gender in health research has a potential to make health research more rigorous, more reproducible, and more applicable to everyone. It's important to also note that not all research has sex and gender dimensions, but these dimensions are often much more applicable than one might first think at sort of a first glance. My research question isn't really related to sex and gender, but hopefully through this module you'll see how you might incorporate some sex and gender considerations regardless of your research question. And it's also important to note that I think SGBA is somewhat of a misnomer, that I think the sex and gender-based analysis sort of section can be much more than just the analysis piece, and I'll show some examples for what I mean about that. So in terms of what not to do in filling out a section on sex and gender-based analysis, this is what I often see when I review scholarship applications or grant applications or thesis proposals, is just a simple sentence: results will be stratified by sex. That is not enough. This section needs to be much more well-rounded and thoughtful. And this is an example of a more complete, in-depth, and thoughtful sex and gender-based analysis response, if you will. So through the course of this module, I will break down this example in terms of kind of different pieces and tips for this. But this is generally kind of what I'm looking for as a reviewer of a scholarship, grant, or thesis proposal. So the first tip is to know the difference between sex and gender. So you can see here, this is from the Canadian Institute of Health Research. You can see the reference is here. When we're talking about gender, typically we're referring to socially constructed roles, behaviors, expressions, and identities of girls, women, boys, men, and gender diverse people. When we're talking about sex, we're typically talking about biology. So CIHR defines sex as biological attributes of humans and animals, including physical features, chromosomes, gene expression, hormones, and anatomy. And you can see this infographic sort of represents these differences in terms of, you can see on the sex side, it's typically about biology, whereas the gender is typically more about identities or behaviors. So in human data categorizing sex typically include, here are categories from these are categories stated from Gendered Innovations at Stanford, which is this amazing resource that talks about differences between sex and gender in practical examples, and I'll provide a link to that later. So in this, the categories for sex are typically male and female, intersex, and then a sex not listed, and then also prefer not to state. In terms of gender, you can see the gender categories are typically woman, man, non-binary, genderqueer, and then also often options for a gender identity not listed here, or again, preferring not to state. I will note, though, that variations in these categories occur as we understand more of sort of the differences between sex and gender. You can see some kind of older surveys don't include these categories. And we also see variations in terms of sometimes only 2 categories are listed, or a few of these categories or they're represented in slightly different ways. But I would say generally this is what we see in health research. So in terms of how you actually apply, okay, so you should know the difference, but then how do you actually apply that to your sex and gender-based analysis section is really to write your working definition of sex and gender. So you can state something like, for the purpose of this application, I define gender as this and sex as this, and you can simply quote the CIHR definitions or another kind of reputable source for these definitions. The next tip is to state that you've completed complete the training and then state that you've completed training in sex and gender-based analysis. So for example, the Canadian Institute of Health Research, and the link is here, has 3 different modules for incorporating sex and gender in biomedical research, in primary data collection, and then also analysis of secondary data. And for the purpose of CIHR, biomedical research typically includes wet lab research, which includes animal models, and also cellular research as well. So that, again, this one is simple to complete the training and then also state that you've completed that training. So you understand the difference between sex and gender, and also that you've completed specific training modules in sex and gender-based analysis. The next tip, which is sort of a subset of tips, is kind of the meatier part of the sex and gender-based analysis section. So when your research can actually differentiate, it says, when you have different organisms, which might be humans or animals, when they are capable of differentiation by sex. And sometimes, of course, that just means, like in the Stanford example, it might just be having data from survey where they asked about sex, or it might be where you actually differentiate maybe based on anatomy. You might distinguish animals based on sex, for example. So when your research when you can differentiate by sex in your research, these are important pieces to include in the sex and gender-based analysis section. So the first is to simply report that you are including, for example, both males and females, or a justification for only including one sex. So it is completely valid to only include one sex depending on the research question. So for example, in a study, I was previously looking at some side effects of prostate medications. And so our sample only included males. And again, so that's perfectly valid, but you do need to report that and justify why you are only including one specific sex, for example. It's also important to note background information, which is really a literature review on known sex differences, or also a known lack of sex differences in a study population. Or with respect to any of the variables you're looking at. So that might be the independent variables or your dependent variables, or your outcome variables. Basically, any aspects of the study question, you can talk about reported differences, or again, a lack of or known lack of differences with respect to any aspects of the study question. So for example, my trainee was looking at the risk of cancer outcomes among individuals with multiple sclerosis who use disease-modifying therapies. So you can report differences in cancer, differences in MS risk or progression, and then also differences in uses of medication therapy. So you can again report any background information on any aspects of the research question related to sex. And then the next part which is really where the analysis part comes of sex and gender-based analysis, is to report how sex will be factored into the analysis plan. So this might include, the most common one I would say is reporting sex stratified results. And you can also say that, that these will be reported even if there are no significant differences, because sometimes we only stratify when we report stratification when we see significant differences. And then also often in health research, sex might be used as a covariate, as a matching factor, in an interaction term, or a combination of these. If you are actually examining sex differences, I also encourage you to consider adding sex differences as a formal objective. In some cases, the research might be very centered around sex differences. It might be the formal primary objective is to examine sex differences. In other cases, you might also, if you are going to look at sex differences, but it's not the primary objective, you might also considering adding it as a formal, maybe secondary objective, if this is possible. And then lastly, this is another piece related not so much to the research itself, but how the research results will be, one other piece is to report, the last piece is to report why it is important to include males and females in terms of generalizability. And if you are examining sex differences, why that's important. And often that's, for example, something like for more targeted treatment, or might be prevention strategies. And then the tips for inclusion in terms of an analysis by gender are almost identical to what I just stated about differences by sex. So to report whether or not you're including different genders, or justification for exclusively focusing on one gender. And then also, again, background information on known differences or lack of differences in any aspects of the research question with respect to gender. And then again, similar to the sex analyses, reporting how gender might be factored in the analysis plan. And then lastly, reporting why it's important to include different genders in terms of generalizability or gender differences, like targeted treatment or prevention strategies. The last tip is to also report how the knowledge translation plan might be tailored. So this is actually a little bit different. It's not actually with respect to your research question. It's about how you might communicate, how your knowledge translation plan might actually be tailored to specific genders, for example. So this is just one example, but there are many different ones that might apply to your own research. This was a study called Knowledge Translation in Men's Health Research, Development and Delivery Content for Use Online. And in this study, they said, this is a direct quote, it said, men can be hard to reach with face-to-face health-related information, while increasingly research shows that they're seeking health information from online sources. So this might be a study, for example, that you could cite in terms of saying how you might tailor your knowledge translation plan to include maybe both face-to-face and also maybe some online sources as well, and state that that's specific for a specific gendered purpose. So I'll now kind of break down this example that I previously showed in relation to some of these tips, and how, and to re-emphasize how you can make this a really well-rounded and in-depth section. So the first section, as I mentioned, is just to incorporate your sort of working definitions for sex and gender. And again, you can really just use a CIHR definition, for example, to state that you just understand the difference. Even if your study, for example, actually cannot address sex and gender, you can still include that you have an understanding of the difference between sex and gender, and then say, for example, that you might not be, that your study is not able to analyze with respect to sex and gender, but you can still include this piece that you understand the difference. So again, the first section in red is really just the working definition of sex and gender. The next section, starting in the blue here, is that background information on sex and gender differences. So in this case, again, the research question was related to looking at skin cancer outcomes in individuals with MS who have been treated with disease-modifying therapies. So this is a practical example of how you can look at any sex and gender differences with any components of those research question. So in this case, it states that in the context of MS, research has shown significant sex differences in both the prevalence, progression of the disease, and response to treatment, with females being more likely to develop MS, and males often experiencing a more aggressive form of the disease. And then it goes on to say the effect of disease-modifying therapies on skin cancer risk is a pertinent area of investigation, as some DMTs, particularly those that alter immune function, may increase skin cancer risk with known sex-based disparities in skin cancer incidence and outcomes. Specifically, studies have found that males are at a higher risk of developing melanoma, while females are more likely to develop non-melanoma skin cancers. Additionally, medication adherence differs by gender, with women generally reporting adherence to treatment regimens, and which may influence efficacy and safety outcomes. So again, this has nothing to do with the analysis I'm actually doing. This is really, again, just setting back. I know some of these differences occur, or equally important, there's a known lack of differences in many aspects of research questions. Again, background literature review in terms of what's known in the study population, or with respect to any of the outcomes or the independent or dependent variables examined. A couple of notes here in terms of it's fine in a short section just to include, if it's in a thesis proposal, to include, you want to include some actual references here in a short section on, for example, a grant or scholarship applications where you're limited by character or word count. It's fine just to put the PubMed IDs in brackets where these should be referenced. So you can see in the kind of the blue and the red section so far, we haven't even talked about yet what we're doing in our specific study. We've just talked about our working definition so far, and also some of the known differences. Okay. The section starting in green here now talks about what we'll actually do. So in this case, we said this study is a secondary analysis of health records and is not able to capture gender. And that was because gender or gender identity was not captured in these records. They only captured sex. So we said we emphasized that we only captured sex, so we were not able to capture gender. And then we said, however, the study will disaggregate data by sex, meaning will provide results, so the odds ratios or whatever outcome measure stratified by sex, and then to examine sex differences in how DMTs or disease-modifying therapies impact skin cancer outcomes. So again, that is really the kind of the analysis component is, okay, so if you do have information on sex, what are you going to do with those specific, how are you going to analyze, how is that going to be incorporated into the analysis plan? The section in purple here now relates to the tip on actually completing those training models and stating that you've completed those. And again, even if you're not directly addressing sex and gender-based analysis, you can still state the working definition, and you can also still state that you've completed sex and gender-based training modules. Okay, the last two pieces, so the last one in yellow is the last tip I talked about related to the knowledge translation plan, simply saying that it will be tailored, recognizing gender-specific preferences in the uptake of research and health information. And then lastly, this is the tip related to including, in terms of saying why it's important. So we've talked about, okay, yes, this is what we know about sex or gender differences. We've talked about what I'm actually going to do in terms of sex and gender-based analyses and how I might tailor my knowledge translation. Okay, but why, if I can examine sex or gender differences, why does this matter? And in this case, we said including both sexes in the analysis is critical to understanding differential responses to therapy and to ensure equitable healthcare outcomes for all MS patients. So obviously you will tailor that to your specific application, but again, just kind of finishing off the end of this paragraph in terms of why does it matter to include, let's say, both men and women? Why does it matter to look at differences? In terms of sex and gender-based analysis resources, one of the best resources I've seen is what's called Gendered Innovations, which is an initiative out of Stanford. And you can see on the left here, they have many resources, but I highly recommend in particular these case studies, and they have both in health and medicine and also in science. So the health and medicine ones, you can see examples like in chronic pain and skin cancer. In the science case studies, they have animal research. They also have stem cells. And they really provide, so similar, I provided the example in multiple sclerosis. They have amazingly in-depth and practical sort of guides in terms of, and examples that are related to these specific areas that are really, really helpful to, they might not exactly apply to your research question, but they'll give you a better understanding of something sort of closely related to your research question that you can apply to really round out your sex and gender-based analysis section. And then also, as I mentioned, the CIHR resources in terms of sex and gender-based analysis in biomedical, primary data collection, and secondary analysis. These are also useful. So that concludes the module on sex and gender-based analysis. I hope this has given you a more in-depth understanding of both the importance of sex and gender-based analyses in research, and then also practical tips for how you can complete these sections for your thesis proposal, and then also for scholarship applications or grant applications in the future.